So the interesting thing that happens with people with depression is that a lot of them will learn to adapt, cope, and survive because they're resilient, because they're strong, because they're adaptable, because they're intelligent. You think that the best you can do is cope and that's not foolish for you to think, right? Because that's what's worked for you. Maybe you've tried treatment, right? But SSRIs don't just magically fix all the depression. And sometimes the reason we believe in coping instead of fixing is because we've tried to fix it before and it hasn't worked, and the best we've come up with is coping. So it makes perfect sense that people come to that conclusion. But with how conserved depression is across the human race, and by conserved I mean by how prevalent and consistent it is across the human race, the fact that after we get yelled at, we feel like crying and going, and sitting in a corner for a little while or a long while, that's a conserved experience across humanity. Okay, let's do TikToks. This is a TikTok.
How often do you still battle with depression?
Oh, I'm always depressed, all the time. I have to constantly bring myself out of it. Like, I wake up depressed, but I'm like, okay, now I know my steps, because you learn from real, now I have to go outside and be in the sun for a little bit, or go for a walk, or start the day this way. It's all just programming yourself to trick your brain,
Were you ever suicidal?
Yeah, all the time. But I can't, because I got a mom and a sister and a family.
Yeah, so I think this is unfortunate, but it's a really common experience, right? So a lot of people struggle with depression, and if you pay attention to the question, it's how often do you battle with depression? So depression feels like a war, right? Where you're going into battle with it every day. It's you wake up in the morning and it's there, right? It's almost like a daily quest that you have to do day after day after day after day. And over time, what happens is people learn how to adapt to it, right? So people learn how to adapt, and they're you figure out over time how to deal with it. So you go outside, get some sunlight. That's good, right? So it sort of notes in on people think about depression as primarily a mental illness, but I think the more I've come to understand, and I think this is actually a shortcoming in our field, is that it's a physical illness too. So we know that vitamin D levels, for example, sun exposure, B12, folate, thyroid levels, all of these physiologic things will influence your depression. And so we develop coping strategies to deal with it, right? And then the person asks him, are you suicidal? He's like, yeah, all the time. And then we also hear about protective factors. That's how we deal with it, right? So even if you pay attention, what you're going to hear is that the way he fights the suicidality is by thinking about the people in his life. But what I'm not hearing from this situation is that this is ever going to get better. And I've seen this a lot, especially in actors and performers, artists, where they sort of live with it day in and day out. And it's a constant war and constant struggle. It can happen to real people too. Whereas the one thing that I'd say is that sometimes it really is that chronic for people, but in my experience as a psychiatrist, 90% of people or 95% of people don't have to do it that way. I know it sounds kind of weird, but so this is where when we think a little bit about depression, I'm not saying that I'm not judging Pete for experiencing what he experiences, but I think what happens when we have depression is, as human beings, we learn how to adapt and we learn how to cope. And once we learn how to adapt and cope, we stop trying to fix the problem. Or that's because we think it's unfixable, which in turn could be the depression itself. Right? So I want y'all to think a little bit about this. If you've got a problem in your house and you manage a fix, right? So let's say that I have to rearrange furniture so that I can plug my computer into a wall. But if I get an extension cord and I run it along the bottom of the floor to the next room and I don't have to move my computer, what's going to happen? I'm never going to move my computer. The extension cord is going to be there. It's going to be a pain in the ass. My computer is going to look disorganized, and I'm never going to fix it. So the interesting thing that happens with people with depression is that a lot of them will learn to adapt, cope, and survive because they're resilient, because they're strong, because they're adaptable, because they're intelligent. And once you learn how to cope, it goes on the back burner. And in the worst cases, you think And for some people, this may be right. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I think thankfully it doesn't seem to be true in most cases. You think that the best you can do is cope and that's not foolish for you to think, right? Because that's what's worked for you. Maybe you've tried treatment, right? But SSRIs don't just magically fix all the depression. It's not just a neurochemical imbalance. Sometimes it requires really deep, hard work that people don't have the bandwidth for, that people don't believe in. And the reason they don't believe in it is because they've tried it before. They've tried versions of it. They've tried everything, and this is what works for them, right? So you have to respect that. But I think it's a really dangerous thing to think about depression as something that can only be coped with. So I do think it can substantially get better, and there's good data to suggest this, right? So interestingly enough, the most promising data, I think, is in a sense the weakest, which is some of this data on psychedelics. So I'm not saying you guys should do psychedelics, but if you look at the outcomes from these studies of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, it looks like it makes fundamental changes within someone's mind and their way of thinking about themselves. There's a whole video about this in terms of the default mode network in Dr. K's guide to depression. But there's also where what we see with meditation is that like there are fundamental changes that happen. Sometimes in psychotherapy, there are fundamental changes that happen with the way that we look at things, like with what we wake up with in the morning. So struggling with depression is a really, really common problem. I think a lot of celebrities and performers and creators struggle with it. And I think that since they're smart, since they're adaptive, since they're resilient, since they have endurance, they develop certain coping strategies. And it's really important to do those things. It's really important to figure out, organize your day, figure out what works for you. The challenge is that I think, unfortunately for the majority of people, because every person I've ever met with depression has 100% developed a way to deal with it. Every single person. The interesting thing is that 90 to 95% of those people that I've worked with don't have to use those things after about a year of treatment. So I think things can permanently get better. I really do believe that. It's been my experience. Now, if you're someone who's tried treatment and it hasn't worked, I'm not saying that it works for everyone. That's the really sad thing, is that we haven't figured out how to guarantee that for people. But I think the challenge is just like the extension cord example, is once we learn how to cope, it's a really important skill. It's what allows us to survive. It's different from fixing it. And sometimes the reason we believe in coping instead of fixing is because we've tried to fix it before and it hasn't worked, and the best we've come up with is coping. So it makes perfect sense that people come to that conclusion. But if you're in that kind of situation where this resonates with you and the most you can do is sort of survive it, I would say don't stop there, right? Try to do additional things. Really try to get to the root of your depression. So sure, you can go into the sun, and that's an excellent thing. Movement is good. Behavioral activation is an evidence-based treatment for depression. Vitamin D supplementation can help people with depression. We have good data behind all that. So it's fantastic. Excellent idea. And don't stop there, right? Start to think a little bit about, if you're suicidal, like, why are you suicidal? What is it that makes life hard? Right? Get to you want to use your coping strategies at the top, but you also want to go deeper and get to the root of it if you can. And some people get to the root of it and there's nothing you can do. And that's unfortunate, but I think thankfully that's the minority of people.
And depression is your body saying, fuck you, I don't want to be this character anymore. I don't want to hold up this avatar that you've created in the world. It's too much for me. You should think of the word depressed as deep rest. Deep rest. Your body needs to be depressed. It needs deep rest from the character that you've been trying to play.
Yes, that's very well said. So I think sometimes we tend to forget, right, that depression is like a variant within the human population. Okay? This is something that y'all really have to understand. It happens to us, arguably for a reason. Now, this is what gets really interesting about mental health, is when we think about pathology, we think about it as a malfunction of something, right? So when someone is sick, their body is not working the way that it's supposed to. But with how conserved depression is across the human race, and by conserved, I mean by how prevalent and consistent it is across the human race, the fact that after we get yelled at, we feel like crying and going, and sitting in a corner for a little while or a long while, That's a conserved experience across humanity. And so sometimes I think we forget, I know it sounds kind of weird, that aspects of depression can actually be like adaptive. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there, right? We wouldn't feel sad and ashamed of ourselves if we get yelled at unless it serves some kind of function. Now, I'm not saying that things don't rise to a pathological level at times, but this is my experience as a psychiatrist, is that sometimes when people come into my office and they're depressed, it's not their brain functioning wrong. It's their brain functioning right. And I know it sounds kind of weird, but like if someone comes into my office and says, I have no reason to live, I live alone, I don't enjoy anything, I have no relationships, I have no job, I'm ashamed of myself, I've never amounted to anything in life. And the interesting thing is that like those statements could be true. Like sometimes there are cognitive distortions. There are usually some cognitive distortions. But sometimes those things are true. And so the answer for that person is, here, take a pill, go home. That's not the answer. The answer is like, okay, if you have no reason to live, like let's work on that. Right? The way to help that person's depression is it's not their brain malfunctioning. There may be some kind of malfunction in there. But that's their brain sort of telling them that this life is not worth living, which sometimes people say like, oh, that means I should kill myself. That's the conclusion people come to. I disagree with that 100%. Don't kill yourself. Build a life that's worth living. And that's when people say, it's hard. And it's like, yeah, I know it is. That's why I'm going to help you. You don't have to do it alone. Right? So it's interesting to hear Jim Carrey talk about deep rest. It's interesting. So this is the experience, like this is what happens when people really like understand their depression and they have an experience of it and they start to realize that sometimes my body needs this. Sometimes my body needs this. And I think it's especially common for people who, as he put it, hold up an avatar, right? We pretend to be this thing for so long that we get tired and I just can't pretend anymore. So I'm going to retreat into a hibernating state. And then I'm going to muster up the energy to come out and pretend to be this thing again. And that too, you know, if that works for you, I mean, the guy's older than I am and I don't know anything about how long he's been dealing with this stuff or where he gets this wisdom from. It sounds really authentic to me. It sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And I think there are other ways to do it. Right? So my experience of people who do this, who go into the deep rest version of depression, is how can you stop pretending? Because if that's what's exhausting, how can you be more authentic? Because it's exhausting. It is so hard to be something that you're not. You have to work so hard to prop up this idea of yourself. Instead, be yourself. But that's hard. Don't get me wrong. It's very, very hard. It's very hard to be authentic, right? It's hard to stand up to people. It's hard to set boundaries. It's hard to be yourself. It's hard to be judged. So hard to be judged. I'm not saying it's easy. Happens slowly. But ultimately, like I've seen that too, where people, once they start living more authentic lives, they will become less depressed. Because you don't need to act anymore. You don't need that deep rest. You don't run out of mana. Your gas tank is not empty. Now, some people may say like that's impossible, or you're saying it's making it sound easy. I'm not saying it's easy. Living an authentic life is one of the hardest things that you'll ever do. But boy, is it worth it. I've seen that in patients I've worked with in terms of like living authentic lives, right? So we're talking a lot about work stuff today. So I go to work every day. I have to pretend to be interested in this crap. I hate it. I hate it. I hate my job. I hate everything about it. But I can't quit. I can't throw it all away. What would I do? I'd give up money. I would have this. Yeah, you have to be more authentic. Yeah, there are going to be sacrifices, but it's going to be worth it almost every single time. Let me think about that for a second. I can't really think of a single person. I'm trying to think. I'm going through like patients that I've worked with. I'm trying to think if there's a single patient I've worked with who has really lived a really authentic life and has not been depressed, or it's not improved their depression. I can't really think of anyone. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened. I just can't think of them. Could be selection bias. Right? Memory isn't perfect. So the couple of takeaways, I think the first is that sometimes it's okay to be depressed. Sometimes if you're, it's hard to put on a mask every day. And like sometimes the way that your body copes with that your brain copes with that is to retreat from the world, and that's okay. And I'm hopeful that that cycle can get better by living more authentically, right? If the problem is that you're tired of lifting up this avatar of yourself, don't lift it anymore, right? That rejuvenates you when you set it down and you retreat. The question is, can you separate the setting down from the retreating? Because what is it that really rejuvenates you? Is it the setting down or is it the retreating? That begs the question, why do you have to retreat when you set it down? What would happen if you set it down and you didn't retreat? Yeah, so I think there's, some value to this, right? But I think this is also one of the problems when it comes to discussions on depression, right? So we've got this video is good because it speaks to some of the problems. One is that a lot of times doctors will say, take this pill to fix your neurochemical imbalance. And that's a part of the answer. I think it's a problem when it becomes the whole of the answer, but sometimes you're not going to understand this unless you actually prescribe antidepressant medication. But once you prescribe antidepressant, or you're someone for whom it has a really good positive effect, but there's some people who I will prescribe antidepressant medication, they will turn into normal human beings. So I'd say for a third of people, antidepressant medication can be revolutionary and life-changing. But I'd say about 70% of people, it either helps some or doesn't help much. A third of people get a really strong response. A third of people get some response, but is nowhere near enough. And a third of people, it really doesn't do much. So then some people who have depression will then we also know on the flip side that stuff like sunshine and exercise and things like that have protective effects against depression. That's true as well. I mean, we heard Pete Davidson kind of say it, right? Getting out, getting in the sun. We also know that vitamin D levels, for example, are very correlated with depression. We know that exercise improves depression. We know that, all kinds of mechanisms. So exercise, getting out in the sun will reduce inflammation, will reduce cortisol levels. All of those things will have positive effects on mood. Right, so those mechanisms are there. So on the one hand, we've got SSRIs that may not work for people. On the other hand, we've got exercise and sunshine and these kinds of things that you're overdosing on, right? We're also overdosing on, we're not just going outside. Suddenly we've taken off our shirt and we're showing our six-pack for unclear reasons. I don't know what that has to do with anything, right? Except maybe gratification of the ego. And then we sort of also get to some really interesting things if we really want to get into this, which is that, first of all, not all depression is the same. So this is what I think really frustrates me sometimes, is that when people make videos like this, they assume that their experience of depression encompasses the variance of experiences of depression. And this is where, I got to say, as a medical professional, sunshine and exercise are fantastic. I recommend it to all my patients. But some people have more of a biologic or organic cause for whom sunshine and exercise is not sufficient. And to imply that those things will work for everyone, I think is irresponsible. Right? And that's where, especially if we look at different, clinical depression, the experience of sadness and depression has a differential diagnosis to it, right? We don't usually talk about this kind of stuff on stream. It has a differential diagnosis to it. And it's interesting because one of the causes of people experiencing very high levels of subjective depression is something like narcissism. So people who are narcissistic will experience high levels of depression. And then the interesting thing about people who are narcissistic is that their depression is a lot more variable and fluctuant and is a lot more environmental in nature. So it's not actually a neurochemical imbalance. If you give a narcissist who's feeling depressed an SSRI, antidepressant medication, it's actually not going to work because the source of their depression is not neurochemical in nature. And so then if we really want to go out of line, we can start to draw conclusions, but we can't really do any of that stuff. But sometimes I see these kinds of things where people are showing off and feeling depressed. And they're saying that this works for me. And it may work for you. But I think there's a variance of what people's depression comes from and what works for it. So should you exercise? Sure. Should you do vitamin D? Sure. Should you get sunlight? Absolutely. Are SSRIs going to work for you? Maybe not. Antidepressant medication going to work for you? Maybe not. But it'll work for some people. It'll help for some people. And so be careful about judging that everyone else's experience of depression is yours, or that your understanding of depression applies to other people. Because it's not unique. It's just like love or enjoyment or satisfaction or how much you like swimming. It's variable.